Entire restoration bay fell silent. The moment the flatbed truck lowered what remained of the midnight blue prototype onto the concrete floor, 3 senior engineers stepped back instinctively, as though the wreckage might somehow be contagious. One crossed his arms and muttered something about insurance write-offs. Another pulled out his phone and began recording, already composing a message to colleagues about the most destroyed vehicle he had ever seen in 22 years of professional work. Beneath the shattered carbon fiber panels and the grotesquely twisted chassis rails, the car barely resembled anything that once moved under its own power. Standing just inside the bay doors in a tailored navy overcoat, Diane Prescott watched every reaction carefully. She had built Prescott Automotive into one of the most respected luxury performance brands in North America. She had negotiated billion-dollar partnerships without flinching. She had fired entire executive teams and restructured divisions over a single weekend without losing sleep. But standing here now watching strangers inspect the crumpled remains of her father's final creation, Diane felt something she almost never permitted herself to feel: helplessness. Craig Mulder, the chief restoration engineer at Highline Motor Works in downtown Toronto, circled the wreckage slowly. He crouched near the front subframe, ran his fingers along a fracture line, then stood and removed his glasses. He cleaned them unnecessarily long before speaking. "Mrs. Prescott, I want to be straightforward with you. This vehicle is beyond any reasonable scope of restoration. The monocoque is compromised in at least 9 critical sections. The powertrain is seized. The suspension geometry is so far out of specification that we would essentially need to engineer a new car from scratch and then make it look like the old one. That is not restoration, that is theater." 2 executives flanking Diane exchanged glances. One leaned toward her ear and whispered that the transport insurance would cover the loss at appraised value. She could commission a replica from the factory floor within 8 months. She could move on. Diane said nothing. She stared at the car, not because this was not a car, not to her. This was the last thing her father William Prescott ever built with his own hands. A prototype he designed during his final year of life, sketching by hand on drafting paper while chemotherapy slowly dismantled his body. Every curve of the bodywork carried intention. Every engineering decision reflected decades of accumulated wisdom poured into one farewell gesture meant specifically for his daughter. William finished the prototype 17 days before he died. Diane drove it exactly once, around the private test track at the Prescott facility in Oakville, with tears streaming down her face and her father's handwritten note still folded in the glove box. Then, 4 months ago, the transport carrier hauling the prototype to a private automotive heritage exhibition in Montreal jackknifed during a freezing rain event near Kingston. The driver survived with minor injuries. The car did not survive at all. For Diane it felt precisely like losing her father twice. Craig Mulder was still talking, something about material fatigue and insurance adjusters and realistic timelines. Diane heard almost none of it. Then a voice came from the far end of the restoration bay, quiet, unhurried, almost apologetic. "The rear subframe is salvageable, so is most of the transmission housing. If you look underneath the firewall damage, the original bulkhead stampings are still intact. That changes everything." Every head in the room turned. The man standing near the rear quarter of the wreck wore a faded gray work shirt with the sleeves rolled past his forearms. His hands were dark with grease. His steel-toed boots were scarred and dull. He looked like he had not slept properly in several days, which was accurate, because he had not. His name was Ethan Calloway, and he was the least senior technician at Highline Motor Works. He had been employed there for just under 14 months. Before that he worked at a transmission shop in Hamilton. Before that, a body repair garage in Brantford. Before that, the world looked very different. Craig Mulder turned toward Ethan with an expression hovering between irritation and disbelief. "Calloway, with respect, you are not part of this consultation. I do not think you fully appreciate the scope of structural failure we are looking at here." Ethan did not argue. He simply pointed toward the underside of the vehicle where a section of the firewall remained remarkably intact, despite the catastrophic damage surrounding it. William Prescott used a redundant bulkhead design in his early prototypes. Most people forgot about it because the production models switched to unitized construction in 2006. But this car was hand-built. I went back to his original philosophy. That bulkhead is the skeleton key to the whole car. If it's intact, and I believe it is, you can rebuild outward from there without compromising the original engineering DNA. Silence. Craig Mulder stared at Ethan for a long moment. Then he almost laughed. "You are telling me you know more about William Prescott's prototype architecture than 3 engineers with advanced degrees and a combined 40 years in performance vehicle restoration." "I am telling you I recognize the design," Ethan said quietly. Because I studied it, for a long time. Before everything changed, Diane Prescott looked at Ethan Calloway carefully for the first time. Not at his stained shirt, not at his worn boots, at his eyes. And she saw something there she had not seen in a single expert, consultant or engineer she had spoken with in the 4 months since the accident. Certainty, not arrogance, not bravado, the deep settled certainty of someone who understood exactly what he was looking at and knew precisely what needed to happen next. She asked him his name, he told her. She asked him how long the restoration would take. He thought carefully before answering. 9 months, maybe 10. If I am given access to the original technical drawings and allowed to source period-correct materials, without going through a purchasing committee, every time I need a $40 gasket. Craig Mulder exhaled sharply. Mrs. Prescott, I strongly advise against this. This man is a floor technician, he has no management experience, no formal credentials in prototype restoration, and frankly, no business being part of this conversation. Diane looked at Craig, then at Ethan, then at the car. I'll give him the bay, she said. And the drawings. Craig Mulder's jaw tightened, but he said nothing further. He had worked with Diane Prescott long enough to recognize when argument was futile. Ethan Calloway did not celebrate, he simply nodded once and walked back to the wreckage. What almost nobody at Highline Motorworks understood, and what Ethan rarely discussed with anyone, was that 15 years earlier he had been one of the most promising young automotive engineers in Ontario. After graduating near the top of his class from the University of Waterloo's Mechanical Engineering program, Ethan joined a small performance engineering consultancy in Kitchener, where he specialized in prototype development and structural analysis. He was exceptionally gifted. Colleagues described his intuition for mechanical systems as almost unsettling, as though he could feel stress points and load paths through his fingertips before the computer models confirmed them. During those years Ethan became deeply fascinated by the work of William Prescott, who was then still alive and actively developing vehicles. Ethan studied every published technical paper, every patent filing, every interview. He understood Prescott's engineering philosophy the way a pianist understands a favorite composer, not just the notes, but the reasoning behind every decision. At 29 Ethan married Megan, a pediatric nurse he met at a friend's cottage weekend in Muskoka. I settled in a small bungalow in Dundas and had a daughter Nora, 2 years later. Life was simple and full. Ethan worked long hours, but he came home to warmth every night. Megan teased him about the grease permanently embedded in his knuckles. Nora fell asleep most evenings with her head on his chest while he read engineering journals on the couch. Then Megan was diagnosed with an aggressive lymphoma shortly after Nora's 4th birthday. Next 18 months dissolved into hospitals, treatments, brief remissions and devastating relapses. Ethan took extended leave from his consultancy, then indefinite leave. Then the consultancy, struggling financially during an industry downturn, quietly eliminated his position while he sat in a hospital corridor at 3 a.m. waiting for test results. Megan died on a Tuesday afternoon in November. Nora was 5 years old. She did not fully understand what happened, only that her mother stopped coming home, and her father cried when he thought she was not watching. The medical debt was enormous. The life insurance Megan carried through the hospital was modest and disappeared almost immediately into outstanding treatment costs. Within a year, Ethan lost the house in Dundas. He and Nora moved into a small apartment above a dry cleaner in Hamilton's East End. He took work wherever it appeared. Transmission rebuilds, brake jobs, oil changes. The engineer who once designed prototype systems for performance vehicles now spent his days replacing mufflers on minivans and trying to explain to his daughter why they could not afford the field trip to the science center. But every night, after Nora finished her homework and fell asleep on the narrow bed they shared in those first desperate months, Ethan sat at the kitchen table and studied. He read technical papers, he sketched structural concepts, he rebuilt small engines he found at scrapyards, purely for the discipline of keeping his hands and mind sharp. He could not afford to stop learning, because learning was the only thing that still felt like the version of himself that Megan once believed in. Nora, now 9, understood more than most children her age. She understood that her father worked very hard for very little money. She understood that he was tired in ways that sleep could not fix. She understood that he was brilliant in ways the world did not currently recognize. And she understood, with the peculiar clarity children sometimes possess, that her father was quietly terrified of failing her. She never told him she knew this. She simply handed him tools when he worked late and sat beside him without speaking the way her mother once did. The first weeks of the restoration were brutal. Ethan worked his regular shifts at Highline during the day, then stayed until midnight, or later dismantling the destroyed prototype with painstaking precision. Every bolt he removed was catalogued. Every fractured component was photographed, measured, and assessed for potential reuse. Most nights, Nora sat in the corner of the bay doing homework under a portable desk lamp Ethan had rigged to a workbench power strip. Craig Mulder made his disapproval visible without ever saying another word directly to Ethan. He reassigned 2 junior technicians away from the project. He slow-walked surplus requisitions. He made subtle comments to other staff about liability and professional standards. The message was clear. He expected Ethan to fail, and he wanted the failure documented. Other mechanics at the shop were divided. Some genuinely wished Ethan well but doubted the project privately. A few resented the attention a floor technician was receiving from a client of Diane Prescott's stature. One veteran body man named Gil, who had worked at Highline for over a decade, was the only colleague who offered practical help. Gil would occasionally stay late to assist Ethan with heavy structural components that required a second pair of hands. He never asked for credit, he simply showed up, helped, and left. You know Mulder is waiting for you to crack, Gil told Ethan one evening while they carefully extracted the damaged rear subframe assembly. I know, Ethan said. Doesn't bother you? Ethan paused. He looked at the subframe in his hands, still faintly bearing the stampings from William Prescott's original tooling. When my wife was sick, he said carefully, people told me to prepare for the worst. Every doctor, every counselor, every well-meaning friend, and they were right. But I spent 18 months fighting anyway. Not because I thought I could change the outcome, but because giving up would have meant she was already gone before she was gone. I do not know how to give up on something that still has life in it. Gil said nothing for a while. Then he picked up a wrench and went back to work. Diane Prescott began visiting the shop with increasing frequency. Initially, she came once a week for formal progress updates, accompanied by at least one assistant and usually a legal advisor. Within 2 months, she was visiting alone, sometimes twice a week, sometimes without scheduling. She told herself the visits were about protecting her investment. That was partly true. But something else drew her back. She watched Ethan explain to Nora how a limited slip differential worked, using 2 plastic cups and a pencil balanced across them. She watched Nora hand her father a ratchet without being asked, anticipating which tool he needed next. She watched the 2 of them share a gas station sandwich on the garage floor at 9:30 at night, because neither had eaten since lunch. And slowly Diane began to see something she had spent years avoiding in her own life. She had built Prescott Automotive into a fortress. After William's death, she poured every ounce of grief into the company, fortifying it against competitors, against economic downturns, against any threat that might diminish her father's legacy. But in doing so, she had also fortified herself against connection, against vulnerability, against the kind of quiet, exhausted love she saw between Ethan and his daughter every time she visited that garage bay. One Thursday evening in late March, Diane arrived at the shop unannounced and found Ethan sitting alone inside the partially restored cockpit of the prototype. The dashboard was still stripped, wiring harnesses hung loose, the seats were absent, but the structure was taking shape. The car was beginning to resemble something William Prescott would have recognized. Ethan was holding a small, framed photograph. Diane could not see the image from where she stood, but she saw his expression. The expression of a man revisiting something precious and painful in equal measure. She almost left without saying anything, but something stopped her. Who is she? Diane asked quietly. Ethan looked up. He did not seem startled. He seemed like a man who had grown accustomed to being interrupted while grieving and had learned to recover quickly. Megan, he said. My wife. She passed away 4 years ago. He paused. She was a nurse, pediatrics. She used to say that children are the only honest engineers because they build things without worrying whether they will fall down, they just build. Diane sat down on an overturned milk crate near the bay door. My father said something similar. He used to tell me that the best engineers are the ones who still remember what it felt like to be amazed by how things work. He said the moment you stop being amazed, you start making compromises. Neither spoke for several minutes. The shop hummed with the low electrical buzz of fluorescent lights and the distant sounds of the city beyond the bay doors. This car, Ethan eventually said, your father built it like someone writing a letter. Every decision is personal. The way the instrument cluster is angled 3 degrees toward the driver, the way the pedal box geometry accounts for someone about 5'7". The seat mounting points are set for a specific body type. He built this car for you, Mrs. Prescott. Not for the market, not for investors, for you. Diane felt something fracture inside her chest, not breaking, more like a frozen thing beginning to thaw. I know, she whispered. That is why I cannot let it go. You do not have to let it go, Ethan said. You just have to let someone help you carry it. Those words stayed with Diane long after she left the shop that night, because she realized, with uncomfortable clarity, that she had spent years carrying her father's legacy entirely alone, refusing help not out of strength but out of fear that accepting help meant admitting she was not enough. The restoration continued through spring and into summer. Ethan solved problems that would have stalled a team of senior engineers. When the original engine block proved irreparably cracked, he sourced an identical casting from a retired Prescott supplier in Oshawa, who still had one stored in a shipping container behind his house. When the bespoke suspension geometry defied conventional alignment equipment, Ethan built a custom jig from scratch, using measurements he reverse-engineered from William Prescott's original drawings and his own intuition about the designer's intent. Nora became an unofficial fixture at the shop. The other mechanics, even the skeptical ones, gradually softened toward her. Gil taught her how to read a torque wrench. A young apprentice named Tamsin showed her how to safely use a die grinder on scrap metal. Nora kept a small notebook where she recorded every major component her father restored, along with the date and a short description in her careful handwriting. She told Ethan it was the car's medical chart, because her mother always kept careful charts on her patients, and Nora believed every important thing deserved someone paying close attention to how it healed. Ethan almost broke once. In early July, a supply chain disruption delayed a critical shipment of hand-formed aluminium body panels from a specialist fabricator in Montreal. Without them, the exterior restoration would stall for weeks, potentially pushing the entire project past the deadline Diane had set for a private unveiling at the Canadian International Auto Show in Toronto the following February. Craig Mulder, who had maintained his quiet campaign of obstruction throughout the project, used the delay as an opportunity to formally recommend cancellation. He presented his case to Diane in a conference room at Highline while Ethan was not present, cited cost overruns, timeline risk, liability concerns. He questioned Ethan's credentials again. He suggested carefully that Diane's emotional attachment to the project was clouding her professional judgment. Diane listened to the entire presentation without interrupting. Then she asked Craig a single question: "Have you looked at what he has actually accomplished so far?" Craig hesitated. "I have read the progress reports. That is not what I asked." "Have you walked into that bay and looked at the car?" Craig had not. He admitted this. "Then I suggest you do that before you recommend canceling anything." That evening, Craig Mulder entered Bay 7 for the first time in months. Ethan was underneath the car, adjusting a suspension link. Nora was at her usual table, working through a math worksheet. The portable radio on the workbench was playing something soft and indistinct. Craig looked at the car. The transformation was extraordinary. A structural tub, which he had personally declared beyond salvation 6 months earlier, was rebuilt with precision he had rarely seen in 30 years of professional work. The welds were immaculate. The panel gaps were tighter than factory specification. The engine bay, still awaiting the rebuilt powertrain, was prepped with a level of care that bordered on obsessive. Every bracket, every mounting point, every threaded fastener was either restored to original condition or replaced with a component so faithfully reproduced it was indistinguishable from the original. Craig stood there for a long time, then he left without saying a word. He never formally recommended cancellation again. The aluminium panels eventually arrived in late August. The exterior restoration accelerated. By October, the car was structurally complete. By December, the powertrain was installed and the first engine start was scheduled. Ethan asked Nora to be present for the initial startup. Gil was there, Tamsin was there. 3 other mechanics who had gradually become invested in the project gathered near the bay. Even Craig Mulder stood at a distance, watching with his arms crossed but his expression unreadable. Ethan turned the key. Nothing happened. He checked the ignition circuit, adjusted a fuel relay, verified the ECU connections, turned the key again. The engine caught, stumbled, then caught again and settled into a low, resonant idle that filled the entire shop with a sound nobody had heard in years. The sound of William Prescott's final engine running exactly as he designed it. Nora looked up from her notebook. Her eyes were wide. "Dad," she said quietly, "it sounds like it's breathing." Ethan could not respond immediately because his throat had closed entirely. He placed one hand flat on the bonnet and felt the vibration travel through his palm, through his wrist, through his arm and into some part of himself he thought had gone permanently numb after Megan died. He was not just rebuilding a car. He was rebuilding proof that the person he used to be still existed somewhere beneath the grief and the grease and the years of being invisible. February arrived faster than anyone expected. The Canadian International Auto Show occupied the Metro Toronto Convention Centre with hundreds of vehicles, thousands of attendees, and an atmosphere of controlled spectacle. Prescott Automotive had reserved a prominent position in the Heritage Pavilion for the unveiling of the restored prototype. Automotive journalists had followed rumors of the restoration for months. The general consensus among industry commentators was skeptical. Several published columns predicted public embarrassment. One prominent automotive journalist wrote that Diane Prescott was risking her professional reputation on a sentimental vanity project managed by an unknown mechanic with no verifiable restoration credentials. The article was shared widely. Ethan read it at 3 in the morning while Nora slept. He set his phone down, looked at the finished car gleaming under the shop lights, and went back to polishing a section of trim he had already polished twice. The evening of the unveiling, the Heritage Pavilion was packed. Industry executives, journalists, engineers, collectors, and enthusiasts filled the space. A large midnight blue curtain concealed the vehicle on an elevated platform. Camera crews positioned themselves for optimal angles. The energy in the room was a mixture of genuine curiosity and the particular anticipation people feel when they suspect they might witness a spectacular failure. Diane stood beside the curtain in a charcoal suit. Her hands were steady. Her voice when she spoke into the microphone was controlled and clear. She thanked the attendees. She spoke briefly about her father's legacy. She described the accident and the damage. She paused. Every expert I consulted told me this car was finished, and they were right. From a technical standpoint, the damage exceeded every conventional threshold for restoration. What they did not account for was the possibility that someone might understand this car, not as a collection of damaged components, but as a letter written by a father to his daughter, and that someone might possess both the skill and the compassion to read that letter and rewrite the parts that were torn, without changing a single word of what the original author intended. She reached for the curtain release. This restoration was performed by one man, working after hours in a single bay, with his 9-year-old daughter beside him. His name is Ethan Calloway. The curtain dropped. The car stood beneath the exhibition lights like something that had never been damaged at all. The midnight blue paintwork gleamed with a depth that seemed almost liquid under the overhead beams. Every line, every curve, every proportion was exactly as William Prescott had drawn it on drafting paper during the final months of his life. The engine bay was a work of art. The interior, stitched and trimmed by hand, honored the original design while incorporating subtle refinements that enhanced both comfort and structural integrity. The room was completely silent for approximately 4 seconds, then the applause began, not politely, not gradually. Erupted, sudden and overwhelming, from every corner of the pavilion simultaneously. Journalists who had prepared skeptical commentary stood with their phones lowered, staring. Engineers moved closer to examine panel gaps and finish quality, then turned to each other with expressions of disbelief. A gray-haired collector in the second row who had known William Prescott personally removed his glasses and pressed his fingers against his eyes. Ethan stood beside the car in a borrowed blazer that did not quite fit properly across the shoulders. Nora stood next to him, holding his hand, wearing a dress she had chosen herself and the small notebook she still carried everywhere. She had added a final entry that morning, February 14, finished. It breathes. But the moment that shifted the room entirely came when Diane returned to the microphone. What I have not yet told you, she said, is that Ethan did not simply restore this car. He improved it. During the rebuild, he identified 3 structural limitations in the original prototype design, limitations my father himself noted in his private engineering journals but never had the opportunity to resolve. Ethan solved all 3. The car you are looking at tonight is not merely a restoration. It is the completion of William Prescott's final vision, finished by someone who understood my father's engineering philosophy deeply enough to know what he would have done if he had been given more time. The applause that followed was different, deeper, more sustained, because the room understood that what they were witnessing was not simply a mechanical achievement. It was one person's refusal to accept that talent and dignity are permanently lost, just because life takes everything else away. Then Diane made the announcement nobody anticipated. Effective immediately, Prescott Automotive is establishing a new restoration and prototype development division. This division will operate with full creative and engineering autonomy. It will be led by Ethan Calloway, and it will carry a name chosen to honor 2 people, who are not here tonight, but whose presence is felt in every millimeter of the car behind me. The division will be called the Prescott Calloway Institute. Ethan looked at Diane. She looked back at him with an expression he recognized immediately, because he had seen it once before, on Megan's face, years ago, the first time she watched him solve a mechanical problem that stumped everyone else in the room. It was the look of someone seeing a person clearly, not as the world had categorized them, not as circumstance had diminished them, but as they actually were. Ethan tried to speak. His voice failed him twice before he managed a single sentence. Megan always told me that broken things deserve the most patience. I think she was right. Nora squeezed his hand. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Later that evening, long after the crowds dispersed and the convention center grew quiet, Ethan stood alone beside the car in the empty pavilion. The exhibition lights were dimmed to a low amber glow. The midnight blue paintwork caught the faint light and held it softly, the way deep water holds the last colors of a sunset. He placed his hand flat on the bonnet, the same way he had during the first engine start months earlier. The metal was cool now. Still, beneath the stillness, he could feel everything. The 18 months of sleepless nights in hospital corridors, the years of oil changes and muffler replacements and pretending he was fine, the quiet evenings at kitchen tables, studying, rebuilding, refusing to let the last spark of who he used to be go dark entirely. Nora's small hand passing him a wrench without being asked, Gil staying late without being thanked, Megan's voice, fading but never fully gone, reminding him that broken things are not finished things. Ethan Calloway was not a man who believed in miracles. He believed in patience, precision, and the stubborn refusal to abandon something simply because the damage looked permanent. Sometimes the people the world has quietly written off are the very ones capable of restoring what everyone else declared beyond saving. And sometimes the most extraordinary things are built not in spite of grief but directly through it, by hands that learned their steadiness from holding on when letting go would have been so much easier.